kick off. We're hideously over time, as you'll have spotted, but luckily, knowing that this is a conference tradition, we had built in very large breaks. So we're going to go on for 45 minutes. We'll then have a very short coffee break, just go and collect and bring it back, and then we'll go straight into the next panel. This panel is going to be looking at the question of how robust is the UK's standard system and what needs to change. So you'll see that the way what we're trying to do today is look at both the history and the current. And you've heard some of the history, and now we're going to relate that to the current in the next two panels. This first one, we have three panelists: Gillian Peel, who is joining us online, Susan Hawley.
Can everybody hear me?
They're incredibly well known in their fields, so I'm not going to give you biographies and introductions. You've all got devices which will enable you to look them up. One thing I will say about Liz, however, is she has just co-authored this absolutely superb book. So if you would like to have a look at the copy, I'll put it at the end. It's called Understanding Corruption. Tells you everything you need to know. It's very cheap. It's very good. Right, there we go, Liz. I've done the advert.
Well,
thank you. So when we're looking at this question of the UK's current standard system and what needs to change, I think we've got a couple of underlying questions that I want us to tease out. The first is, how good is the UK standards regime? We just heard a little bit about, both from Miles and Ian, about how maybe we have a tendency to think it's better than it is. There are different regimes, obviously, for Parliament and the civil service. And maybe in international comparisons, we're not quite as good as we might hope. So we want to look at how good it is, and we also want to ask the question: are the people adhering to it, covered by it, adhering to it, and has this got better or worse? We're going to try and do all that in 45 minutes. But you know, we've got the lunch break to have chats and so on. I've asked each of the panelists to start off with 5-minute interventions. I'm going to be quite strict about those 5 minutes, to the extent that, Ben, could you bring over my iPhone, which I left there? So I'm going to give strict timing on it, and we're going to start off with Gillian, who is a member of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, but just to be very clear, is not speaking in that capacity. So she's speaking in her capacity as a distinguished academic in the field, albeit she is a member of the CSPL. But it's actually very fortunate that she is a member of the CSPL, because we've asked her precisely to focus on the recent CSPL report, looking at the UK standard system and areas that can change, and maybe some weaknesses in the system that the CSPL has highlighted. So Gillian, over to you. 5 minutes. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Right, well, I think the first point I would make very quickly is that the standard system developed into a system. You couldn't really say there was one before the establishment of the Committee on Standards in Public Life and the first Nolan report in the mid-1990s. And I think that's very important, that if we actually think about the quality of our integrity institutions, it really is a product of that relatively recent period. Obviously, the committee over the period between then and 2021 looked at a number of institutions, revisited them, developed new machinery, and elucidated the so-called Nolan principles and their application to specific areas of public life. Not until the most recent report, which I'm going to focus on a little bit, but it has 34 recommendations, so I'm only going to select a few of them. Not until this last report of 2021, upholding standards in British public life, was there a complete and comprehensive review of the whole landscape. And I think that's really important. But in that review, it did, of course, identify areas which needed to be strengthened and threats to the machinery, and it does focus mainly on the machinery. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Areas where perhaps the institutions and the machinery are no longer fit for purpose, and where things could be done to reinforce the ability of our integrity institutions to promote high standards. I'm just going to highlight really 4 of the 34 recommendations that were made, or highlight 4 areas where I think there are general themes that we'll probably want to pick up on. The first is that the committee's report in 2021 advocated strengthening the independence of a number of institutions by putting them on a statutory footing. Many of the bodies which regulate areas of British public life are advisory institutions which could be, in a sense, abolished overnight, as the Committee on Standards in Public Life itself could be. And they depend very much on securing support from government and operating informally. So what the committee did was to suggest that some of those institutions should be given a statutory framework to give them greater security and perhaps greater ability to resist government pressure. And the ones that particularly, I think, which are particularly important, are the Committee on Business Appointments, the Commissioner for Public Appointments, the person who vets the way appointments are handled, and the very controversial office, the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Conduct. Of course, introducing primary legislation is always a problem for governments. They usually have over full timetables, and that is not necessarily going to be something that's going to be quickly forthcoming. In some areas, it didn't recommend change. It didn't make any recommendations in relation to the Committee on Standards in Public Life itself, nor did it make any recommendations for change in the House of Lords Appointments Commission. The second area, which I think we want to focus on, is really relates to sanctions, because there is some concern that the enforcement of the rules has not been as strict as it could be. And there it definitely recommended a strengthening of sanctions in some areas, particularly related to the business appointments rules, where additional financial sanctions for people who broke the rules were recommended. There was thirdly, an important change, and I think this does touch on the slightly delicate way in which many of these institutions work. There was a change recommended to the way the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Interests works, in that whereas in the past an issue has to be sent to the Independent Advisor, the committee recommended that that office be able to initiate inquiries. And then there was a certain amount, and I think we probably want to come back to this as well, a certain amount of recommendation for change in relation to the actual machinery, the transparency, for example, of meetings between ministers and lobbying groups. A recommendation that the collection of data be centralized and that it be certainly made much more speedily forthcoming. There are, as I say, 34 recommendations, and I'm not sure how many minutes that would take to actually talk about them all, but I certainly haven't got that amount of time. What I want to just end on saying is that, of course, the committee, when it makes these kinds of recommendations, looks at these areas, is entirely dependent, it's an advisory committee, on the government responding positively. And so far, but this was only November, the government has not given any indication about what it is going to do in relation to these recommendations. The report was very well received. There was a leader in the Times which said that these recommendations should immediately be implemented, and senior figures such as John Major, who of course was responsible for setting up the Committee on Standards in Public Life in the first place, delivered a very powerful lecture arguing that standards needed more protection and that the committee's recommendations should be taken note of. I think at the end of the day, you're always going to have a tension with the government, which won't necessarily want to have the same priorities, won't necessarily have the same priorities as the committee. And some of the recommendations do require a degree of organisational upheaval and statutory change, which perhaps the government will not necessarily see as one of its top priorities. So I think that's my 5 minutes, isn't it?
It is indeed, and thank you, Julian. That was impeccable.
Thank you.
Great. Well, we'll move straight on to Liz in that case. Liz has been advising on the Parliamentary Standards regime, and I want to ask Liz to focus very specifically on the parliamentary side of things, and also to perhaps to have a look at the impact of the Owen Paterson affair. Liz, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. My esteemed co-author on a fantastic new book, by the way. I wanted to talk about the very brief and very recent history of parliamentary standards. It's been fascinating actually to hear Miles's talk this morning, but I was going to look really at the last 30 years and then zoom in on the last 6 months, so a much shorter period. But in thinking about parliamentary standards in the UK in that period, as Miles said, we didn't really have much until the early 90s, and in fact Julian also talked about how we didn't have much until then with the setting up of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. But we have had for that period a Committee on Standards in the House of Commons, so a select committee. But the structure of that and the philosophy behind it has been very much one of self-regulation. Parliament regulating its own conduct and its own individual members. And I think the broad rationale for that has been that you don't want there to be a risk that something that an MP says can get them into trouble, and the executive could come and squash them for saying something that criticises the government. So Parliament, of course, has got roles of legislation, of representation, and of scrutiny. And for that scrutiny role, it's very important that MPs feel free and independent to be able to criticise the government. So you don't want a system in which the executive can come in and if someone's critical, then boot them out of office or sanction them. So that's been the rationale for self-regulation. At the same time, in the last 30 years, what we've seen is shifting away from that self-regulation principle. This has typically been in response to scandals. So we've seen over time, we've seen the introduction of independent parts. So we have a commissioner for standards who's appointed by Parliament but has some independence in judging and investigating individual cases of alleged misconduct. We had, after the expenses scandal, the introduction of the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, which is specifically for looking at expenses and conduct around expenses and financial interests. We've had lay members on the Standards Committee for some years now, and in fact the number of lay members has been increased so that they now have a 50-50 split between lay members and MPs, and in fact that gives them the potential to dominate because the chair traditionally doesn't vote. And we've had, in response to allegations of bullying and harassment in the Commons, the setting up of the Independent Complaints and Grievances System. Now, all of these things have moved us towards a more independent oversight, particularly in the overseeing of conduct of individual MPs and the enforcement, although MPs are still setting the rules. So that's the backdrop. Then in November, what happened is the Committee on Standards, as part of its regular work, it reviewed a report that had been given to it by the Commissioner on Standards, who had investigated allegations against one of the Conservative MPs, Owen Paterson. The report had found that Paterson had egregiously breached the rules which ban paid advocacy, lobbying on behalf of particular interests. And the evidence was, set out in the report. It was a very beefy report, and there were many instances where Patterson had clearly engaged in lobbying for companies from which he was being paid. The sanction that the Committee on Standards proposed was that he should be suspended from Parliament for 30 days. I think that's a fairly minimal actual sanction for a fairly egregious breach of the rules. It is true that that could potentially also have led to a recall petition, whereby 10% of the electorate in the constituency can sign a petition recalling the MP, and a by-election would have to be held, although the MP could stand in that. But on the face of it, this was only about a 30-day suspension. The government, however, decided that it did not want that to go ahead and started to completely overturn the usual practice of supporting what the Committee on Standards recommends in terms of sanctions, and instead suggested a wholly new system, that the system should be reformed, that they would set up a new committee, that committee would be chaired by a member of the government benches, which is also against the convention, and that the whole system needed reform, and started to call it into question. Since then, there was then, so that sparked a debate over whether there should be a more judicial process, with some people on the government benches in particular arguing that the process should in fact not be regulated by MPs, and there should be again a move to a more independent, external and quasi-judicial process for investigating allegations of misconduct. In fact,
your 5 minutes is drawing to a close.
Great. In fact, the government was forced to withdraw its proposal within 24 hours. There was a big backlash against it. But I find it interesting because it seems to me where we've ended up is in a debate between some MPs actually arguing that they shouldn't be seen to mark their own homework, and sort of a move towards more and more independent regulation and away from self-regulation. And my own worry actually is that I still think that that basic principle stands, that the self-regulatory system was based on. And I worry that in fact what we're seeing is MPs refusing to take responsibility for regulating the conduct of themselves and their peers. And I think that's actually quite a retrograde step to move away and into this more independent oversight.
Thank you, Liz. Sue, we'll come straight on to you. Unlike the other members of the panel, both of whom are academics, despite your distinguished academic background yourself, you're a campaigner. So what do you think needs to change, and how can you get change?
So how to change? I thought I'd start with how to change it, because it is it's a thorny issue. We can have as many fabulous reports from CSPL as we like, and they are, really great, really important stuff. But what's the bottleneck? Why aren't they just being picked up? I thought I would start with a little bit of work that we've been doing around public attitudes to change and to solutions. And just say also, it does seem that there is, actually, if you look at it, there's been a lot of talk about, there's a crisis of integrity at the moment. But that crisis of integrity has been going on for quite a while. So if you look at the kind of trust in politicians going back to, CSPL public attitude surveys in 2004, it's gone down every year, and the amount of people thinking that it's not good enough has gone up. And that started under Labour. So you can see the number of those who thought standards were poor went from -11% to -28% between 2004 and 2012. And this is really problematic because it is damaging to democracy. And I think it would be really interesting to have that discussion, like, how do we, where's the evidence base to prove that, to show that that is actually happening, because it's really hard to persuade people of that. But one of the obvious things is it makes people feel that Westminster is a bubble. It makes it easy to exploit populist sentiment. But the thing that we found from doing some focus groups, so ourselves and Transparency International UK got very Dominic Cummings and did some red wall focus groups and blue wall ones too. And what we found is that it's actually, people do really care about this. They are really angry, but it's not the thing they care about most. They still would, if you give them a kind of ranking, they'd still put NHS, Brexit, anything day to day, anything they can relate to above this issue about how politicians behave. And there's lots, it's kind of, they don't really understand about, how Westminster works, and so they, they can much more relate to things like Partygate, where they can say, they had rules, politicians had rules, or the PPE scandals. And then actually, very worryingly, there's an incredible amount of fatalism, that this is just how politicians are and how politics works. The Blue Wall focus group people we talked to, that's much more like, this is just how society works, actually. This is just a reflection of society. The Red Wall participants were just they were very, very upset and angry. They felt like they were being taken the mickey out of, but they just felt nothing would ever change. And that was just how it is. So just, I think in terms of the solutions, we did test them. And what was really interesting about that is we tested a whole range of solutions, both in these focus groups and then in a survey of MPs. So in the really key thing that came out is that people do want independent oversight of politicians. And they want stricter regulations and they want more punishment. Those were the three areas where people really felt, yes, that really resonates. So like a criminal offence of corruption in public office, really strong support for that. A lot of talk about, the police have the Independent Complaints Commission, why don't politicians have an independent body? A sense that it should be judge-led to be properly independent. We tested all sorts of other things like stopping ministers taking jobs in the private sector where they had influence for 5 years, lobbying transparency, a strong ministerial code, and people, they weren't interested in those. So those are a very strong mandate for a proper independent body. So I think the other thing that came out was like, who would they trust to say these things? And this was a bit that actually surprised me. Not business, not charities, it was judges. They thought judges were the best voice that could be most trusted on this. But then here's the problem, is the mismatch. So we also worked with a positive survey of MPs, and this was last June, and you just have this complete mismatch. So Labour MPs who aren't in power, very, very supportive of new regulation and new legislation to strengthen regulation of standards. 8 out of 10 Labour MPs, just 3 out of 10 Conservative MPs. Only 24% of Conservative MPs thought there should be a corruption in public office offence. Only 8% thought that the independent advisor on ministerial interests needed any strengthening. So we have this very kind of serious mismatch, and we've talked to quite a lot of Conservative MPs about why they don't support this. Some of it is just like, that's just would be a waste of time. I'm not going to invest political capital. They care about it, they know it's an issue, but they just don't see any chance of change. It's a kind of reflection of what the public think. And others, it's ambition thing. They don't want to put their head above the parapet and see remove possibility of promotion or appointments. So I think that's a kind of overview. Have I run out of nearly my 5 minutes now, haven't I?
Yes, but it was so interesting. I let you have a good extra.
Looking forward to discussing it all.
Great, thank you, Sue. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating, and thank you, Gillian and Liz. I'm going to ask you a couple of sort of basic questions that come out of that. The first is that there's a counter-argument that runs against this in a way. You're all saying, well, the system isn't great at the moment, and there are some holes. And in a very formal sense, Gillian's highlighted some 34 recommendations to plug some holes in the system. And you two have also had a look at some of those things. The counter-argument is the system's working pretty well. That the independent media is highlighting these transgressions, that Owen Paterson is no longer an MP, etc., etc. So, question number one to the panel is, what do you think of that counter-argument? And the sort of related question to that is, if on the other hand we accept there is a problem and there are some issues going on here, then are attempts to reform just going to be a bit of a damp squib? or do you think we've got to a big bang moment? And Miles and Ian both mentioned a couple of those where suddenly, for whatever convergence of circumstances, there was a big change and a big impetus. So damp squib or big bang, and what do you think of the counter argument? Gillian, can I come to you first?
Yes, I mean, I think the system is working much, much better than it was, but it depends when you go back to. I think there clearly are weaknesses, and one weakness is, of course, that governments have other priorities. And I think what we've seen in the last decade has probably been an emphasis, in fact, going back even perhaps to the great financial crisis, much greater an emphasis on delivering policy and seeing standards in a sense as, I hate to use the word fluff, but certainly peripheral to the major concerns of the government, and the government would allege the electorate. Then you get the great emphasis on the delivery of Brexit. Then we've had COVID. Now we've got the Ukraine. I mean, I think there is a sense in which getting government to focus on standards is important and not always easy. So I think that's the first point. I'm not surprised that the public is particularly concerned about Partygate. It's the thing that they can all relate to. What I think is much more difficult is seeing whether any system would be better. I can't think of a better way of organising this. What the Committee on Standards in Public Life has done has been to encourage and refine systems, regulatory systems, for the particular areas of public life that are being covered. I don't think trying to, have one major systems regulator that actually had enforcement powers will work at all. It would be centralising far too much. But I don't think at the end of the day it would command the respect that the current regulators do. So I think there is a sense in which, yes, we can identify weaknesses, but you're always going to be able to identify weaknesses in the way systems operate, because some of these standards problems, like the poor, are always going to be with you. So in a sense, I think what we need to do is to try to engage politicians and to reassert the importance and centrality of standards to the quality of our democracy. I think the basic structure that we've got at the moment is sound, but it does need more engagement. We also need, and this is just a final point, the committee is at the moment looking at building an ethical culture and leadership in these sorts of areas. And I think the machinery, tinkering with the machinery, radical reform to the machinery, can only go so far. You also need to address the issues of leadership and building a culture of high standards.
Gillian, can I just probe you on that? And it comes to the second round of questions I was going to ask, which is, and you're hinting there that, however good your machinery is, it can always be let down by the people if your culture is not right. Do you think it's really a problem of people and culture that we've got at the moment, and not a problem of machinery?
I mean, I think that you always need to ensure that people keep standards issues, and by people, I don't just mean the Prime Minister and the government, I also mean the people who are interacting with the public. I think in the private sector, it's important to keep the culture sensitive to standards issues. I think, yes, it does come down to people, but it's not something you can say, well, we've done that. We've given them an induction course. I think you have to keep it at the front of their consciousness. And that, I think, probably does involve putting a lot more attention, giving a lot more attention to the way in which recruitment, training, refresher courses are conducted, not just in government departments or in local government, but perhaps much more broadly across public life generally, and the private sector.
Thank you,
Julie. I mean, I don't know whether you were trying to get at the good chap theory of of government, but I think there is a sense in which what we really want is a society in which governing institutions understand what the Nolan principles actually entail and relate them to their everyday practice or professional lives.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to come to you next. My same questions apply. What do you think of the counter-argument and damp squib or Big Bang? I'm going to go and stand over there and look at the chat that's unfurling. So I might lob in some other questions if they're coming through the chat, but carry on. Sue, and then Liz. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think the system is working. I don't think, more importantly, I think the regulators themselves don't think it's working. You know, clearly the independent advisor is having very serious talks about how he should have more powers. Eric Pickles has been pretty vocal about his lack of powers. So I think, you know, I think the CSPL report is really good at showing how it isn't working, actually, and I think it's a very carefully balanced and delicate report, which is, you know, calibrated to try and make politicians take a realistic approach, and I think it's deeply depressing that it hasn't yet had a government response. So I think there is a widespread sense that the system isn't working. We also know that the misconduct in public office offence isn't working, that it's been, you know, Law Commission has done a big report calling for a new offence. We know that, for instance, during the PPE scandals, the police have pretty much indicated they're not going to be able to bring any cases because we don't have a trading and influence offence in the UK. So there are lots of ways in which I think that are kind of really big symptoms of how it isn't working. In terms of the damp squid or the Big Bang, this is really, really tricky. I think, and we think generally, I think in the NGO think tanky world, that the CSPL report is the minimum threshold. And even that seems so hard to get. But I think, and many of you will know that, you know, the Labour Party have put out a big proposal out there to have an Integrity and Ethics Commission. I think that the issue, it is a tricky one, because if we could make these regulators stronger, that's a very, very important first step. But in terms of getting public engagement and a kind of public sense of things are being done, there would be benefits to a bit more consolidation, whether it's these regulators coming together and forming a kind of quad of integrity quad, or, you know, something that makes it look like it's coordinated, not just a fragmented bit picking off different bits of the system. And I think this is one of the things we found tricky, is that when there's so many different bits to it, you know, do you just focus on House of Lords reform? Do you focus on, you know, ministerial interests? Do you focus on second jobs? And it becomes a bit overwhelming. So I think the advantage of some form of consolidation is it would kind of give more public profile, I guess, to the fact that something can be done about it and these regulators have powers. But that's different from, I don't know how it looks, and that's a different discussion.
Okay, thank you. Liz, before I come to you, I want to ask a follow-up question to Sue. But before that, I should say that the most common question on the chat is, could the panellists speak up? So, Ben, I noticed the microphones on here are red rather than green. Could you just check in with the conference people and see if they can turn these to green? That might solve our speaking up issue. So my follow-up question is that one of the parties has proposed the idea of having an independent commission to deal with some of these issues. What do you think of the idea of an independent commission that scoops up lots of these standards things together?
Well, I think the danger of consolidation is you lose good stuff, and you have to be really, really mindful and careful of that. So I thought, you know, some form of, I thought there was some real merits to the proposal that you have 4 or 5 commissioners. You never want to centralise power in one commissioner. I think that is a recipe for them being picked off, and I think the CSPL report makes some good comments about its reservations about whether you centralise and make it more of a political target and more likely to be captured. But I think, you know, there needs to be some form of centralisation to show that this is a group of people who are together improving integrity. So I think it depends what that commission looks like, and I think that the real danger in all of this, which we've certainly found, is that it becomes politicised so very quickly that it, you know, and it becomes a political beating stick for the opposition, and then it becomes quite difficult for people who are independent to make headway, because it's just seen as, you know, that's a Labour thing. And I don't know how we get round that. We need maybe more judges. Evolved, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Sue. So Liz, I'm going to come to you last, and I want to work in your work on state capture to this. So hang on for a very complex question.
Okay.
So the question is, I talked about the sort of backlash and the sense that the system is basically working okay, so don't worry, everybody. And Owen Paterson is an example of that. But the counter argument to that, at its most extreme, is actually we've taken the first steps to a situation of state capture, which we've seen in many countries. And this, in a way, is drawing on what Miles said earlier about interests being prominent, as opposed to the public interest. You have written and are writing on state capture. How do you think the UK stacks up with regard to taking the first steps? And what does it look like if you get into a situation of state capture?
Okay, so perhaps I'll just start with the kind of isn't the system working? And I think when you started to introduce that, you talked about the fact that, well, actually that attack at the time of the Owen Paterson thing was overturned pretty quickly. And I guess I have a couple of concerns about that, which will bring me into the state capture. So one is what the public cares about seems to me quite random. So there was quite a lot of backlash against that, and there were also important regulators, including Lord Evans, who stood up against it. But we'd had a series of other things which I think were pretty egregious, which didn't really get noticed. So, for example, the Robert Jenrick sitting next to a property developer at a dinner and then going in and interfering with a decision that had already been made in a highly unusual way, to allow the property developer to avoid paying a large amount of tax. I mean, that seemed to me something that would really warrant some investigation. Didn't really get much coverage. So one problem with sort of relying on the public is that what the public cares about is random. So what about what the MPs and the people in public office think? From some interviews that I did with MPs about a year ago now, a couple of things that worried me there were there was a really very prevalent sense that ethics and matters of integrity are common sense. So there's a lack of recognition, I think, that this is difficult. And actually, I really don't think it's black and white and straightforward with many of these issues, but it's not good if the people who are in the office think that it's straightforward. So we need to have more recognition of that. They also talk a lot about, well, the only real legitimate check on MPs' power is the electorate. And I'm not that confident that electoral accountability is working for the reasons I just said, but also because we know that many seats in this country are safe seats. And if you don't like your MP, you've still got very little chance of throwing them out. So those are my sort of, in a sense, the superficial or surface worries about whether the system's working. But the bigger worries are around some systematic undermining of accountability institutions in the last couple of years. And this is where the state capture comes in. So state capture is a concept that was often developed in the late 90s, early 2000s for thinking about Russia and the ability of business interests to capture big parts of the state and assets of the state. In the last 10 or so years, we've seen that kind of pattern emerging, but driven very much by politics and people in government rather than driven by the business interests. And that's often come along with not just changing the rules of game and controlling the policy making so that it benefits fairly narrow interest groups, but it's also come along with disabling accountability institutions so that you can do that kind of thing without there being any check on your power. So we've seen that, for example, in Hungary under Orban, in Turkey under Erdogan, many countries around the world. And what I think worries me in the UK is that in the last couple of years there have been a number of moves which seem to be doing some of that systematic disabling and undermining of accountability institutions. So we see it with the reform of the Electoral Commission, we've seen it with attacks on judges, we've seen it with the prorogation of Parliament, actually, we've seen it with attacks on the BBC, and the way that the handling of the privatisation of Channel 4 has been handled, and with day-to-day measures like refusing to speak to the BBC about various things, or not allowing certain journalists into press briefings. All of those things are essentially undermining those checks and balances. And the worry about that is that then we are quickly into a situation where the system is not working. And actually those little checks and bounces back that seem to be sometimes pushing us back onto the right course are not going to be able to happen.
Great, thank you, Liz. We're pretty much out of time, but luckily my second round of questions was wrapped into those questions. So I'm going to go to each of the panellists and ask one final question, which is, imagine the scenario in which you had a Prime Minister who had no fixed ideology and seemed to change his mind on a whim, and this week was in favour of revamping the ethics and standards regime. What's the one thing you would like him to do? Gillian?
Depends what sort of revamping. What's you mean? Do you mean, was there one thing amongst the recommendations or reforms that we would like him to change?
Yeah.
Gosh, I think I would get the various proposals from the committee to strengthen some of the bodies and put them on a statutory basis.
Great, thank you, Julian. Sue?
We have a news roundup, and our comms person put an April Fool in our thing saying Prime Minister accepts in full the CSPL recommendations. Definitely they would announce that they're going to introduce an integrity and ethics bill as soon as possible, putting on a statutory basis all the independent statutory regulators, standards regulators.
Okay, I'm afraid I reject that answer, because you had said that was the minimum standard, that accepting the CSPL was the minimum. What do you really want to share it with me?
Well, I mean, I think actually what I really want is a proper independent police force, actually, that is responsible for addressing domestic corruption and has the power to knock down government door offices.
Wow, I feel a new conference coming up. Liz?
Okay, what I really want is proportional representation of the electoral system, because I think that would really shake up politics and accountability. It would mean that the executive couldn't be so incredibly dominant, and would just put us in a healthier position.
And on that bombshell, we finish this panel. Thank you to my panellists. Gillian, thank you for being so patient with us online. That was impeccable use of Zoom. Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you.
Thank you.